Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. I got so many interesting comments to the 2010 Best Living Conductors lists that I thought I would add a little codicil because one of them really kind of piqued my interest. One of the writers mentioned, or commentators, or one of you people said, why don't you do a list of the 10 greatest living composers if you can find them? Ha ha, wise ass, snarky sort of comment at the end. But it's actually an interesting question. And I wanted to take it seriously and address it that way. And I wanted to explain specifically why it's impossible to do a list of the 10 best living composers. It really is. It's completely impossible. Why is it? Well, first of all, any of these lists that we're doing, as you may have noticed, depends on having a certain fund of shared information. For example, when we talked about the conductors, I was very specific. Not that any of you paid attention to it, or some of you did, some of you didn't. I said the selections have to be based on a body of work memorialized in recordings. Otherwise, how are we going to do it? I said, I'm not interested in knowing that you went to see a concert and you thought it was wonderful, or that the orchestra loved conductor so and so, or that people think such and such was a nice guy, or none of that matters. That was all anecdotal fluff and nonsense. You have to be able to hear the actual music. So, number one criterion for finding the 10 best living composers is we have to have recordings. We have to have lots of recordings. We have to have recordings of a body of work. In other words, ideally to make the list of the 10 best anything, they should all be dead. And the more dead they are, the better it is, because the more work they left and the more complete that body of work is, the more information we have to make an assessment. And if they're still around, it's actually a little bit problematic because you never know what's going to happen. Now, I did say that the 10 best living conductors was a list for the moment because it's changing all the time. It has to change in real time. Our perception is going to change as we evaluate these people and their work. But with composers, you're talking about stuff that hasn't even been written yet. At least with conductors and soloists and other people, you're talking about people who are performing a body of music that we all know, and we can make ready comparisons. But there's nothing to compare somebody's original work to except themselves, basically. And so that's the first reason why coming up with living composers is impossible. The second observation that I would like to make is that our assessment of who the great composers are, this very question, was somehow predicated on an assumption. And the assumption that, well, it was easy to know who the great composers were back then when they had really great composers, and we don't have any now. Well, that's totally not true. That's absolutely contrary to the historical facts. If you wanted to know who the greatest opera composer was in Mozart's day, they would have said it was Cimarosa. I mean, there were always many, many, many more people out there who were much more popular than the ones we may think are the best now. We just don't listen to them now, so we don't pay attention to them. I mean, that's an obvious point, but I think it's one worth mentioning. Second of all, we are talking about a very, very limited type of music. We're talking about classical music or music written for classical ensembles, serious art music, whatever you want to call it, right? But that's only a teeny, tiny, negligible amount of the musical activity which is going on in these days. It could be that the greatest composer is not a classical composer. It could be that the greatest composer of the 20th century is going to turn out to be Duke Ellington. We don't know. He was a great composer. There are many great composers who write in other media or other types, but because they're all getting recorded now, and their work is being preserved, we have a much, much wider selection. Think about it in Haydn and Mozart's day. Haydn was amazing. He was the most popular composer in Europe in his lifetime. But what does that mean? Even if you're the most popular composer in Europe in your lifetime, it means a tiny, tiny group of people are hearing your work. There were no recordings. So you only heard it when it was actually performed. And if it was actually performed, the audience would number a couple hundred rich people. They would be the nobility, the upper middle class, in a city or town or place that had a population in the maybe hundreds of thousands if you were lucky, and most likely in the tens of thousands, and that was considered a large city. Our criteria for singling out who is popular and who is not, and who is great and who is not, now, today, is based on a representative sample with digital downloads of the internet of exposure to millions and millions of people in this vast sea of material and people and stuff. And it's just huge. Back then, and with the hindsight of history, we're talking about people who have been singled out as the greatest by half a dozen people, a tiny number of people in a tiny little place. So it was so much easier. I mean, think about it. Brahms was not actually terribly popular in his day. He wasn't. He was considered a difficult composer. Wagner, I mean, nowadays, Wagner. Who would have said Wagner was the greatest composer of opera in his day? Probably nobody except Wagner and his disciples, all 12 of them. That's how many disciples you usually get, right? I mean, seriously, how many people had an opportunity to hear the music and to pronounce on it and to make a considered decision? All of this is happening because we have the ability to take in the entire historical context and all of the recordings and music and criticism and literature and whatnot, and that informs our decision today. So how are we supposed to use that vetting, winnowing process with today's live composers? I could give you a list of lots of terrific live composers. I mean, there's Jennifer Higdon, there's Jonathan Leshnoff, there's John Adams. I'm just talking about American composers. If you wanted to include the recently deceased, we could talk about Christopher Rouse and George Crumb and Eno Juhani Rautavaara. I mean, they were all around until fairly recently. They're wonderful composers, great composers. They may turn out to be the list of great composers of the recent 20th century. But to say we should have a list of the 10 best living composers is impossible. It's silly. It's really silly. All we can say is possibly who the most played are. You could just do the numbers. So-and-so has the right connections. Such and such is getting lots of performances, lots of commissions. So that gives them a certain cachet of popularity and exposure. But are they the greatest or the best or the ones we're going to remember permanently? No, we can't say that. There's no way to say that. And I just think that we need to keep our historical perspective. It's a totally different situation with performing artists. Performing artists are all doing the same thing, and they have a body of work that we can compare. And so we can make decisions. They may not be the right ones. They may not be. But it's very clear who's doing the most work, who's getting the most attention, and actually among the pile of listeners, the pool of listeners such as yourselves and critics and other people who are in the realm of classical music, the consensus as to who the best players and conductors are is actually a pretty strong one. You've shown it yourself. You've seen the names that keep coming up, and my second list of the top 10 to make the 20 top 10 was based on your input because there is a genuine body of interested people listening to the stuff. There is no such body with respect to composers. There simply is not. Even if the evidence existed to be able to make a decision, which it doesn't. So I wanted to address that because I just think it's so easy and rather cheap and intellectually facile to talk about how terrible everything is now, how we don't know. And the only reason people think it's terrible is because they're not listening. I am absolutely convinced of that. And I say that to the commentator who wrote that comment. Get off your ass and start listening, and then you'll know who you think the 10 best living composers are. Because one thing I do know, whether or not we can say who they are, or I can say who they are, propose a list, they're out there. Of course they're out there. There's no question that they're out there. Greatness is not rare. It isn't rare at all. Musical talent isn't rare. There's tons of it. We're drowning in it. We are drowning in a sea of competency and excellence. And the difficulty is winnowing it out in a way that there is a consensus agreement that this is what we're looking for, and these are the people who do it best, and this is what we value. There is no consensus now. So it's a question of small groups having their own views of things. And how it's all going to shake out, that's for the future to determine. It could be that in 200 years, they're gonna look back on this period, the early 2100s, and say the greatest composer was someone we've never heard of, who was never got the attention that they deserved, or somebody who was writing music and publishing and self-publishing it on the internet. And it only started to get listened to or performed gradually. And the people who we think are the best people now, no one's going to care about. We don't know. We can't know. We don't want to know. I don't care about knowing. All we can do, and I say this over and over again, is keep on listening, and listen with an open mind and without bitterness. The one thing that did strike me, I just have to finish with this, is that there were quite a few comments on those conductor lists about how everybody is bland, everybody is boring, everybody is terrible. I pity you people. I really do. Why do you bother? What are you listening for? Why waste your time? I don't understand it. I truly don't. If you are really so insensitive to the excellence and the splendidness of all of the music that's out there and all of the opportunities we have to listen to it, and the constant delight in encountering something new and wonderful. I mean, I just did a video on the Hartman orchestral music. It was a premiere. No one had heard it. It's fabulous. I mean, what's wrong with you people? Just lighten up. Lighten up and enjoy. That's what it's there for. And if you think that everything sucks, don't waste your time commenting here. I have to say that very, very honestly. Go somewhere else. I really think that that's just a horrible position to be in, and you don't need to share the bile and bitterness that seems to be your artistic life. I'm not interested in it, and I don't think anyone else here is either. So, on that happy note, I mean, come on, we're having a great time doing this. And as far as living composers go, I mean, they're alive and they're composing. That's all we can say about them. We'll learn more when they're dead and decomposing. That is the sad fact, but it's the truth. So do keep on listening. Thank you so much for joining me. Take care.